The Renaissance at Charleroi by O. Henry. Grandemont Charles was a little Creole gentleman, aged 34, with a bald spot on the top of his head and the manners of a prince. By day, he was a clerk in a cotton broker's office in one of those cold, rancid mountains of oozy brick down near the levee in New Orleans. By night, in his three-story high chamber garnier in the old French Quarter, he was again the last male descendant of the Charles family, that noble house that had lorded it in France, and had pushed its way smiling, rapiered, and courtly into Louisiana's early and brilliant days. Of late years the Charleses had subsided into the more republican, but scarcely less royally carried magnificence and ease of plantation life along the Mississippi. Perhaps Grandemont was even Marquis de Brass. There was that title in the family, but a marquis on $75 per month.
Vraiment.
Still, it has been done on less. Grandemont had saved out of his salary the sum of $600. Enough, you would say, for any man to marry on. So, after a silence of 2 years on that subject, he reopened that most hazardous question to Adèle Fauquier, riding down to Meade d'Or, her father's plantation. Her answer was the same that it had been any time during the last 10 years. First find my brother, Monsieur Charles. This time he had stood before her, perhaps discouraged by a love so long and hopeless, being dependent upon a contingency so unreasonable, and demanded to be told in simple words whether she loved him or no. Adèle looked at him steadily out of her gray eyes that betrayed no secrets and answered, a little more softly, Grandemont, you have no right to ask that question unless you can do what I ask of you. Either bring back brother Victor to us, or the proof that he died. Somehow, though 5 times thus rejected, his heart was not so heavy when he left. She had not denied that she loved. Upon what shallow waters can the bark of passion remain afloat? Or, shall we play the doctrinaire, and hint that at 34 the tides of life are calmer and cognizant of many sources instead of but one as at 4 and 20? Victor Fauquier would never be found. In those early days of his disappearance there was money to the Charles name, and Grandemont had spent the dollars as if they were picayunes in trying to find the lost youth. Even then he had had small hope of success, for the Mississippi gives up a victim from its oily tangles only at the whim of its malign will. 1,000 times had Grandemont conned in his mind the scene of Victor's disappearance, and, at each time that Adèle had set her stubborn but pitiful alternative against his suit, still clearer it repeated itself in his brain. The boy had been the family favorite, daring, winning, reckless. His unwise fancy had been captured by a girl on the plantation, the daughter of an overseer. Victor's family was in ignorance of the intrigue, as far as it had gone. To save them the inevitable pain that his course promised, Grandemont strove to prevent it. Omnipotent money smoothed the way. The overseer and his daughter left, between a sunset and dawn, for an undesignated bourne. Grandemont was confident that this stroke would bring the boy to reason. He rode over to Meade d'Or to talk with him. The two strolled out of the house and grounds, crossed the road, and mounting the levee, walked its broad path while they conversed. A thundercloud was hanging, imminent, above, but, as yet, no rain fell. At Grandemont's disclosure of his interference in the clandestine romance, Victor attacked him, in a wild and sudden fury. Grandemont, though of slight frame, possessed muscles of iron. He caught the wrists amid a shower of blows descending upon him, bent the lad backward and stretched him upon the levee path. In a little while the gust of passion was spent, and he was allowed to rise. Calm now, but a powder mine where he had been but a whiff of the tantrums, Victor extended his hand toward the dwelling house of Meade d'Or. You and they, he cried, have conspired to destroy my happiness. None of you shall ever look upon my face again. Turning, he ran swiftly down the levee, disappearing in the darkness. Grandemont followed as well as he could, calling to him, but in vain. For longer than an hour he pursued the search. Descending the side of the levee, he penetrated the rank density of weeds and willows that undergrew the trees until the river's edge, shouting Victor's name. There was never an answer, though once he thought he heard a bubbling scream from the dun waters sliding past. Then the storm broke, and he returned to the house drenched and dejected. There he explained the boy's absence sufficiently, he thought, not speaking of the tangle that had led to it, for he hoped that Victor would return as soon as his anger had cooled. Afterward, when the threat was made good and they saw his face no more, he found it difficult to alter his explanations of that night, and there clung a certain mystery to the boy's reasons for vanishing as well as to the manner of it. It was on that night that Grandemont first perceived a new and singular expression in Adèle's eyes whenever she looked at him, and through the years following that expression was always there. He could not read it, for it was born of a thought she would never otherwise reveal. Perhaps, if he had known that Adèle had stood at the gate on that unlucky night, where she had followed, lingering, to await the return of her brother and lover, wondering why they had chosen so tempestuous an hour and so black a spot to hold converse, if he had known that a sudden flash of lightning had revealed to her sight that short, sharp struggle as Victor was sinking under his hands, he might have explained everything, and she? I know what she would have done. But one thing is clear, there was something besides her brother's disappearance between Grandemont's pleadings for her hand and Adèle's yes. 10 years had passed, and what she had seen during the space of that lightning flash remained an indelible picture. She had loved her brother, but was she holding out for the solution of that mystery or for the truth? Women have been known to reverence it, even as an abstract principle. It is said there have been a few who, in the matter of their affections, have considered a life to be a small thing as compared with a lie. That I do not know. But, I wonder, had Grandemont cast himself at her feet, crying that his hand had sent Victor to the bottom of that inscrutable river, and that he could no longer sully his love with a lie, I wonder what she would have done. But Grandemont Charles, Arcadian little gentleman, never guessed the meaning of that look in Adèle's eyes. And from this last bootless payment of his devoirs he rode away as rich as ever in honor and love, but poor in hope. That was in September. It was during the first winter month that Grandemont conceived his idea of the Renaissance. Since Adèle would never be his, and wealth without her were useless trumpery, why need he add to that hoard of slowly harvested dollars? Why should he even retain that hoard? Hundreds were the cigarettes he consumed over his claret, sitting at the little polished tables in the Royal Street cafes while thinking over his plan. By and by he had it perfect. It would cost, beyond doubt, all the money he had, but le Jouvot la chandelle for some hours he would be once more a Charles of Charleroi. Once again should the 19th of January, that most significant day in the fortunes of the House of Charles, be fittingly observed. On that date, the French king had seated a Charles by his side at table. On that date Armand Charles, Marquis de Brasse, landed, like a brilliant meteor, in New Orleans. It was the date of his mother's wedding, of Grandemont's birth. Since Grandemont could remember, until the breaking up of the family, that anniversary had been the synonym for feasting, hospitality, and proud commemoration. Charleroi was the old family plantation, lying some 20 miles down the river. Years ago the estate had been sold to discharge the debts of its two bountiful owners. Once again it had changed hands, and now the must and mildew of litigation had settled upon it. A question of heirship was in the courts, and the dwelling house of Charleroi, unless the tales told of ghostly powdered and laced Charleses haunting its unechoing chambers were true, stood uninhabited. Grandemont found the solicitor in Chancery who held the keys pending the decision. He proved to be an old friend of the family. Grandemont explained briefly that he desired to rent the house for 2 or 3 days. He wanted to give a dinner at his old home to a few friends. That was all. "Take it for a week and month, if you will," said the solicitor, "but do not speak to me of rental." With a sigh he concluded, "The dinners I have eaten under that roof, mon fils." There came to many of the old, established dealers in furniture, china, silverware, decorations, and household fittings at their stores on Canal, Chartres, St. Charles, and Royal Streets. A quiet young man with a little bald spot on the top of his head, distinguished manners, and the eye of a connoisseur, who explained what he wanted. To hire the complete and elegant equipment of a dining room, hall, reception room, and cloakrooms. The goods were to be packed and sent, by boat, to the Charleroi landing, and would be returned within 3 or 4 days. All damage or loss to be promptly paid for. Many of those old merchants knew Grandemont by sight, and the Charleses of old by association. Some of them were of Creole stock and felt a thrill of responsive sympathy with the magnificently indiscreet design of this impoverished clerk who would revive, but for a moment, the ancient flame of glory with the fuel of his savings. "Choose what you want," they said to him. "Handle everything carefully. See that the damage bill is kept low, and the charges for the loan will not oppress you." To the wine merchants next, and here a doleful slice was lopped from the 600. It was an exquisite pleasure to Grandemont once more to pick among the precious vintages. The champagne bins lured him like the abodes of sirens, but these he was forced to pass. With his 600, he stood before them as a child with a penny stands before a French doll. But he bought with taste and discretion of other wines, Chablis, Moselle, Chateau d'Or, Hoheimer, and port of right age and pedigree. The matter of the cuisine gave him some studious hours until he suddenly recollected André, their old chef, the most sublime master of French Creole cookery in the Mississippi Valley. Perhaps he was yet somewhere about the plantation. The solicitor had told him that the place was still being cultivated, in accordance with a compromise agreement between the litigants. On the next Sunday, after the thought, Grandemont rode, horseback, down to Charleroi. The big, square house with its two long L's looked blank and cheerless with its closed shutters and doors. The shrubbery in the yard was ragged and riotous. Fallen leaves from the grove littered the walks and porches. Turning down the lane at the side of the house, Grandemont rode on to the quarters of the plantation hands. He found the workers just streaming back from church, careless, happy, and bedecked in gay yellows, reds, and blues. Yes, André was still there. His wool a little grayer, his mouth as wide, his laughter as ready as ever. Grandemont told him of his plan, and the old chef swayed with pride and delight. With a sigh of relief, knowing that he need have no further concern until the serving of that dinner was announced, he placed in André's hands a liberal sum for the cost of it, giving carte blanche for its creation. Among the blacks were also a number of the old house servants, Absalom, the former major domo, and a half-dozen of the younger men, once waiters and attachés of the kitchen, pantry, and other domestic departments crowded around to greet Monsieur Grandet. Absalom guaranteed to marshal of these a corps of assistants that would perform with credit the serving of the dinner. After distributing a liberal largesse among the faithful, Grandemont rode back to town well pleased. There were many other smaller details to think of and provide for, but eventually the scheme was complete, and now there remained only the issuance of the invitations to his guests. Along the river within the scope of a score of miles dwelt some half-dozen families with whose princely hospitality that of the Charleses had been contemporaneous. They were the proudest and most august of the old regime. Their small circle had been a brilliant one, their social relations close and warm, their houses full of rare welcome and discriminating bounty. Those friends, said Grandemont, should once more, if never again, sit at Charleroi on a 19th of January to celebrate the festal day of his house. Grandemont had his cards of invitation engraved. They were expensive, but beautiful. In one particular their good taste might have been disputed, but the Creole allowed himself that one feather in the cap of his fugacious splendor. Might he not be allowed, for the one day of the Renaissance, to be Grandemont Dupuis Charles of Charleroi? He sent the invitations out early in January so that the guests might not fail to receive due notice. At 8 o'clock on the morning of the 19th, the Lower Coast Steamboat River Belle gingerly approached the long and used landing at Charleroi. The bridge was lowered, and a swarm of the plantation hands streamed along the rotting pier, bearing ashore a strange assortment of freight. Great shapeless bundles and bales and packets swathed in cloth and bound with ropes, tubs and urns of palms, evergreens and tropical flowers, tables, mirrors, chairs, couches, carpets, and pictures, all carefully bound and padded against the dangers of transit. Grandemont was among them, the busiest there. To the safe conveyance of certain large hampers eloquent with printed cautions to delicate handling he gave his superintendents, for they contained the fragile china and glassware. The dropping of one of those hampers would have cost him more than he could have saved in a year. The last article unloaded, the River Belle backed off and continued her course downstream. In less than an hour, everything had been conveyed to the house. And came then Absalom's task, directing the placing of the furniture and wares. There was plenty of help, for that day was always a holiday at Charleroi, and the Negroes did not suffer the old traditions to lapse. Almost the entire population of the quarters volunteered their aid. A score of pickaninnies were sweeping at the leaves in the yard. In the big kitchen at the rear, Andre was lording it with his old-time magnificence over his numerous subcooks and scullions. Shutters were flung wide. Dust spun in clouds. The house echoed to voices and the tread of busy feet. The prince had come again, and Charleroi woke from its long sleep. The full moon, as she rose across the river that night and peeped above the levee, saw a sight that had long been missing from her orbit. The old plantation house shed a soft and alluring radiance from every window. Of its 2 rooms, only 4 had been refurnished: the larger reception chamber, the dining hall, and 2 smaller rooms for the convenience of the expected guests. But lighted wax candles were set in the windows of every room. The dining hall was the chef d'oeuvre. The long table, set with 25 covers, sparkled like a winter landscape with its snowy napery and china and the icy gleam of crystal. The chaste beauty of the room had required small adornment. The polished floor burned to a glowing ruby with the reflection of candle light. The rich wainscoting reached halfway to the ceiling. Along and above this had been set the relieving lightness of a few watercolor sketches of fruit and flower. The reception chamber was fitted in a simple but elegant style. Its arrangement suggested nothing of the fact that on the morrow the room would again be cleared and abandoned to the dust and the spider. The entrance hall was imposing with palms and ferns in the light of an immense candelabrum. At 7 o'clock, Grandemont, in evening dress, with pearls of family passion in his spotless linen, emerged from somewhere. The invitations had specified 8 as the dining hour. He drew an armchair upon the porch and sat there, smoking cigarettes and half dreaming. The moon was an hour high. 50 years back from the gate stood the house, under its noble grove. The road ran in front, and then came the grass-grown levee and the insatiate river beyond. Just above the levee top, a tiny red light was creeping down and a tiny green one was creeping up. Then the passing steamers saluted, and the hoarse din startled the drowsy silence of the melancholy lowlands. The stillness returned, save for the little voices of the night, the owl's recitative, the capriccio of the crickets, the concerto of the frogs in the grass. The pickaninnies and the dawdlers from the quarters had been dismissed to their confines, and the melee of the day was reduced to an orderly and intelligent silence. The 6 colored waiters, in their white jackets, paced, cat-footed, about the table, pretending to arrange where all was beyond betterment. Absalom, in black and shining pumps, posed, superior, here and there where the lights set off his grandeur. And Grandemont rested in his chair, waiting for his guests. He must have drifted into a dream, an extravagant one, for he was master of Charleroi and Adèle was his wife. She was coming out to him now. He could hear her steps. He could feel her hand upon his shoulder. "Pardon-moi, Monsieur Grande." It was Absalom's hand touching him. It was Absalom's voice, speaking the patois of the blacks. "But it is 8 o'clock." 8 o'clock. Grandemont sprang up. In the moonlight he could see the row of hitching posts outside the gate. Long ago the horses of the guests should have stood there. They were vacant. A chanted roar of indignation, a just, waxing bellow of affront and dishonored genius came from Andre's kitchen, filling the house with rhythmic protest. The beautiful dinner, the pearl of a dinner, the little excellent superb jewel of a dinner. But one moment more of waiting, and not even the 1,000 thunders of black pigs of the quarter would touch it. "They are a little late," said Grandemont, calmly. "They will come soon. Tell Andre to hold back dinner, and ask him if, by some chance, a bull from the pastures has broken, roaring, into the house." He seated himself again to his cigarettes. Though he had said it, he scarcely believed Charleroi would entertain company that night. For the first time in history, the invitation of a Charles had been ignored. So simple in courtesy and honor was Grandemont, and perhaps so serenely confident in the prestige of his name, that the most likely reasons for the vacant board did not occur to him. Charleroi stood by a road traveled daily by people from those plantations whither his invitations had gone. No doubt, even on the day before the sudden reanimation of the old house, they had driven past, and observed the evidences of long desertion and decay. They had looked at the corpse of Charleroi and then at Grandemont's invitations, and, though the puzzle or tasteless hoax or whatever the thing meant left them perplexed, they would not seek its solution by the folly of a visit to that deserted house. The moon was now above the grove, and the yard was pied with deep shadows save where they lightened in the tender glow of outpouring candle light. A crisp breeze from the river hinted at the possibility of frost when the night should have become older. The grass at one side of the steps was specked with the white stubs of Grandemont's cigarettes. The cotton broker's clerk sat in his chair with the smoke spiraling above him. I doubt that he once thought of the little fortune he had so impotently squandered. Perhaps it was compensation enough for him to sit thus at Charleroi for a few retrieved hours. Idly his mind wandered in and out many fanciful paths of memory. He smiled to himself as a paraphrased line of scripture strayed into his mind. A certain poor man made a feast. He heard the sound of Absalom coughing a note of summons. Grandemont stirred. This time he had not been asleep, only drowsing. 9 o'clock, M'shi Grande, said Absalom in the uninflected voice of a good servant who states a fact unqualified by personal opinion. Grandemont rose to his feet. In their time all the Charleses had been proven, and they were gallant losers. Serve dinner, he said calmly, and then he checked Absalom's movement to obey, for something clicked the gate latch and was coming down the walk toward the house. Something that shuffled its feet and muttered to itself as it came. It stopped in the current of light at the foot of the steps and spake, in the universal whine of the gaddying mendicant. Kind sir, could you spare a poor, hungry man, out of luck, a little to eat, and to sleep in the corner of a shed? For, the thing concluded, irrelevantly, I can sleep now. There are no mountains to dance reels in the night, and the copper kettles are all scoured bright. The iron band is still round my ankle, and a link. If it is your desire, I should be chained. It set a foot upon the step and drew up the rags that hung upon the limb. Above the distorted shoe, caked with the dust of 100 leagues, they saw the link in the iron band. The clothes of the tramp were reeked to piebald tatters by sun and rain and wear. A mat of brown, tangled hair and beard covered his head and face, out of which his eyes stared distractedly. Grandemont noticed that he carried in one hand a white, square card. "What is that?" he asked. "I picked it up, sir, at the side of the road." The vagabond handed the card to Grandemont. "Just a little to eat, sir. A little parched corn, a tortilla, or a handful of beans. Goat's meat I cannot eat. When I cut their throats they cry like children." Grandemont held up the card. It was one of his own invitations to dinner. No doubt someone had cast it away from a passing carriage after comparing it with the tenantless house of Charleroi. "From the hedges and highways bid them come," he said to himself, softly smiling. And then to Absalom, "Send Louis to me." Louis, once his own body servant, came promptly, in his white jacket. "This gentleman," said Grandemont, "will dine with me. Furnish him with bath and clothes. In 20 minutes have him ready and dinner served." Louis approached the disreputable guest with the suavity due to a visitor to Charleroi and spirited him away to inner regions. Promptly, in 20 minutes, Absalom announced dinner, and, a moment later, the guest was ushered into the dining hall where Grandemont waited, standing at the head of the table. The attentions of Louis had transformed the stranger into something resembling the polite animal. Clean linen and an old evening suit that had been sent down from town to clothe a waiter had worked a miracle with his exterior. Brush and comb had partially subdued the wild disorder of his hair. Now he might have passed for no more extravagant a thing than one of those poseurs in art and music who affect such oddity of guise. The man's countenance and demeanor, as he approached the table, exhibited nothing of the awkwardness or confusion to be expected from his Arabian Nights change. He allowed Absalom to seat him at Grandemont's right hand with the manner of one thus accustomed to be waited upon. "It grieves me," said Grandemont, "to be obliged to exchange names with a guest. My own name is Charles. In the mountains," said the wayfarer, "they call me Gringo. Along the roads they call me Jack. I prefer the latter," said Grandemont. "A glass of wine with you, Mr. Jack." Course after course was served by the supernumerous waiters. Grandemont, inspired by the results of André's exquisite skill in cookery and his own in the selection of wines, became the model host, talkative, witty, and genial. The guest was fitful in conversation. His mind seemed to be sustaining a succession of waves of dementia, followed by intervals of comparative lucidity. There was the glassy brightness of recent fever in his eyes. A long course of it must have been the cause of his emaciation and weakness, his distracted mind, and the dull pallor that showed even through the tan of wind and sun. "Charles," he said to Grandemont, for thus he seemed to interpret his name, "you never saw the mountains dance, did you?" "No, Mr. Jack," answered Grandemont, gravely. "The spectacle has been denied me. But, I assure you, I can understand it must be a diverting sight. The big ones, you know, white with snow on the tops, waltzing, décolleté, we may say." "You first scour the kettles," said Mr. Jack, leaning toward him excitedly, "to cook the beans in the morning, and you lie down on a blanket and keep quite still. Then they come out and dance for you. You would go out and dance with them, but you are chained every night to the center pole of the hut. You believe the mountains dance, don't you, Charlie?" "I contradict no traveler's tales," said Grandemont with a smile. Mr. Jack laughed loudly. He dropped his voice to a confidential whisper. "You are a fool to believe it," he went on. "They don't really advance. It's the fever in your head. It's the hard work and the bad water that does it. You are sick for weeks, and there is no medicine. The fever comes on every evening, and then you are as strong as two men. One night the Compania are lying drunk with mezcal. They have brought back sacks of silver dollars from a ride, and they drink to celebrate. In the night you file the chain in two and go down the mountain. You walk for miles, hundreds of them. By and by the mountains are all gone, and you come to the prairies. They do not dance at night. They are merciful, and you sleep. Then you come to the river, and it says things to you. You follow it down, but you can't find what you're looking for." Mr. Jack leaned back in his chair, and his eyes slowly closed. The food and wine had steeped him in a deep calm. The tense strain had been smoothed from his face. The languor of repletion was claiming him. Drowsily he spoke again. "It's bad manners, I know, to go to sleep at table, but that was such a good dinner, Grande, old fellow." "Grande?" The owner of the name started and set down his glass. How should this wretched tatterdemalion whom he had invited, caliph-like, to sit at his feet know his name? Not at first, but soon. Little by little, the suspicion, wild and unreasonable as it was, stole into his brain. He drew out his watch with hands that almost balked him by their trembling and opened the back case. There was a picture there, a photograph fixed to the inner side. Rising, Grandemont shook Mr. Jack by the shoulder. The weary guest opened his eyes. Grandemont held the watch. "Look at this picture, Mr. Jack. Have you ever—" "My sister Adèle." The vagrant's voice rang loud and sudden through the room. He started to his feet, but Grandemont's arms were about him, and Grandemont was calling him Victor. Victor Fauquier.
"Merci, merci, mon Dieu."
Too far overcome by sleep and fatigue was the lost one to talk that night. Days afterward, when the tropic calentura had cooled in his veins, the disordered fragments he had spoken were completed in shape and sequence. He told the story of his angry flight, of toils and calamities on sea and shore, of his ebbing and flowing fortune in southern lands, and of his latest peril when, held a captive, he served menially in a stronghold of bandits in the Sonora Mountains of Mexico, and of the fever that seized him there and his escape and delirium, during which he strayed, perhaps led by some marvelous instinct, back to the river on whose bank he had been born, and of the proud and stubborn thing in his blood that had kept him silent through all those years, clouding the honor of one, though he knew it not, and keeping apart two loving hearts. What a thing is love, you may say, and if I grant it, you shall say, with me, what a thing is pride. On a couch in the reception chamber Victor lay, with a dawning understanding in his heavy eyes and peace in his softened countenance. Absalom was preparing a lounge for the transient master of Charleroi, who, tomorrow, would be again the clerk of a cotton broker, but also, tomorrow, Grandemont was saying, as he stood by the couch of his guest, speaking the words with his face shining, as must have shone the face of Elijah's charioteer when he announced the glories of that heavenly journey. Tomorrow I will take you to her. The Remnants of the Code, by O. Henry. Breakfast in Coralio was at 11. Therefore the people did not go to market early. The little wooden market house stood on a patch of short-trimmed grass, under the vivid green foliage of a breadfruit tree. Thither one morning the vendors leisurely convened, bringing their wares with them. A porch or platform 6 feet wide encircled the building, shaded from the mid-morning sun by the projecting, grass-thatched roof. Upon this platform the vendors were wont to display their goods: newly killed beef, fish, crabs, fruit of the country, cassava, eggs, dulces, and tottering stacks of native tortillas as large around as the sombrero of a Spanish grandee. But on this morning, they whose stations lay on the seaward side of the market house, instead of spreading their merchandise, formed themselves into a softly jabbering and gesticulating group. For there upon their space of the platform was sprawled, asleep, the unbeautiful figure of Beelzebub Blythe. He lay upon a ragged strip of cocoa matting, more than ever a fallen angel in appearance. His suit of coarse flax, soiled, bursting at the seams, crumpled into 1,000 diversified wrinkles and creases, enclosed him absurdly, like the garb of some effigy that had been stuffed in sport and thrown there after indignity had been wrought upon it. But firmly upon the high bridge of his nose reposed his gold-rimmed glasses, the surviving badge of his ancient glory. The sun's rays, reflecting quiveringly from the rippling sea upon his face, and the voices of the market-men woke Beelzebub Blythe. He sat up, blinking, and leaned his back against the wall of the market. Drawing a blighted silk handkerchief from his pocket, he assiduously rubbed and burnished his glasses. And while doing this he became aware that his bedroom had been invaded, and that polite brown and yellow men were beseeching him to vacate in favor of their market stuff. If the señor would have the goodness 1,000 pardons for bringing to him molestation, but soon would come the compradors for the day's provisions, surely they had 10,000 regrets at disturbing him. In this manner they expanded to him the intimation that he must clear out and cease to clog the wheels of trade. Blythe stepped from the platform with the air of a prince leaving his canopied couch. He never quite lost that air, even at the lowest point of his fall. It is clear that the College of Good Breeding does not necessarily maintain a chair of morals within its walls. Blythe shook out his wry clothing and moved slowly up the Calle Grande through the hot sand. He moved without a destination in his mind. The little town was languidly stirring to its daily life. Golden-skinned babies tumbled over one another in the grass. The sea breeze brought him appetite, but nothing to satisfy it. Throughout Coralio were its morning odors, those from the heavily fragrant tropical flowers and from the bread baking in the outdoor ovens of clay and the pervading smoke of their fires. Where the smoke cleared, the crystal air, with some of the efficacy of faith, seemed to remove the mountains almost to the sea, bringing them so near that one might count the scarred glades on their wooded sides. The light-footed Caribs were swiftly gliding to their tasks at the waterside. Already along the bosky trails from the banana groves files of horses were slowly moving, concealed, except for their nodding heads and plodding legs, by the bunches of green golden fruit heaped upon their backs. On door-sills sat women combing their long, black hair and calling, one to another, across the narrow thoroughfares. Peace reigned in Coralio, arid and bald peace, but still peace. On that bright morning when nature seemed to be offering the lotus on the dawn's golden platter, Beelzebub Blythe had reached rock bottom. Further descent seemed impossible. That last night's slumber in a public place had done for him. As long as he had had a roof to cover him, there had remained, unbridged, the space that separates a gentleman from the beasts of the jungle and the fowls of the air. But now he was little more than a whimpering oyster led to be devoured on the sands of a southern sea by the artful walrus, circumstance, and the implacable carpenter, fate. To Blythe money was now but a memory. He had drained his friends of all that their good fellowship had to offer. Then he had squeezed them to the last drop of their generosity, and at last, Aaron-like, he had smitten the rock of their hardening bosoms for the scattering, ignoble drops of charity itself. He had exhausted his credit to the last reel. With the minute keenness of the shameless sponger, he was aware of every source in Coralio from which a glass of rum, a meal, or a piece of silver could be wheedled. Marshalling each such source in his mind, he considered it with all the thoroughness and penetration that hunger and thirst lent him for the task. All his optimism failed to thresh a grain of hope from the chaff of his postulations. He had played out the game. That one night in the open had shaken his nerves. Until then there had been left to him at least a few grounds upon which he could base his unblushing demands upon his neighbor's stores. Now he must beg instead of borrowing. The most brazen sophistry could not dignify by the name of loan the coin contemptuously flung to a beachcomber who slept on the bare boards of the public market. But on this morning no beggar would have more thankfully received a charitable coin, for the demon thirst had him by the throat, the drunkard's matutinal thirst that requires to be slaked at each morning station on the road to Tophet. Blythe walked slowly up the street, keeping a watchful eye for any miracle that might drop manna upon him in his wilderness. As he passed the popular eating house of Madama Vasquez, Madama's boarders were just sitting down to freshly baked bread, aguacates, pines, and delicious coffee that sent forth odorous guarantee of its quality upon the breeze. Madama was serving. She turned her shy, stolid, melancholy gaze for a moment out the window. She saw Blythe, and her expression turned more shy and embarrassed. Beelzebub owed her 20 pesos. He bowed as he had once bowed to less embarrassed dames to whom he owed nothing, and passed on. Merchants and their clerks were throwing open the solid wooden doors of their shops. Polite but cool were the glances they cast upon Blythe as he lounged tentatively by with the remains of his old jaunty air, for they were his creditors almost without exception. At the little fountain in the plaza, he made an apology for a toilet with his wetted handkerchief. Across the open square filed the dolorous line of friends to the prisoners in the calaboza, bearing the morning meal of the immured. The food in their hands roused small longing in Blythe. It was drink that his soul craved, or money to buy it. In the streets he met many with whom he had been friends and equals, and whose patience and liberality he had gradually exhausted. Willard Getty and Paula cantered past him with the coolest of nods, returning from their daily horseback ride along the old Indian road. Keogh passed him at another corner, whistling cheerfully and bearing a prize of newly laid eggs for the breakfast of himself and Clancy. The jovial scout of fortune was one of Blythe's victims who had plunged his hand oftenest into his pocket to aid him. But now it seemed that Keogh, too, had fortified himself against further invasions. His curt greeting and the ominous light in his full, gray eye quickened the steps of Beelzebub, whom desperation had almost incited to attempt an additional loan. 3 drinking shops the forlorn one next visited in succession. In all of these his money, his credit, and his welcome had long since been spent. But Blythe felt that he would have fawned in the dust at the feet of an enemy that morning for one draught of a guardian. In 2 of the pulperias his courageous petition for drink was met with a refusal so polite that it stung worse than abuse. The 3rd establishment had acquired something of American methods, and here he was seized bodily and cast out upon his hands and knees. This physical indignity caused a singular change in the man. As he picked himself up and walked away, an expression of absolute relief came upon his features. The specious and conciliatory smile that had been graven there was succeeded by a look of calm and sinister resolve. Beelzebub had been floundering in the sea of improbability, holding by a slender lifeline to the respectable world that had cast him overboard. He must have felt that with this ultimate shock the line had snapped, and have experienced the welcome ease of the drowning swimmer who has ceased to struggle. Blythe walked to the next corner and stood there while he brushed the sand from his garments and repolished his glasses. "I've got to do it, oh, I've got to do it," he told himself aloud. "If I had a quart of rum I believe I could stave it off yet for a little while. But there's no more rum for Beelzebub, as they call me. By the flames of Tartarus, if I'm to sit at the right hand of Satan, somebody has got to pay the court expenses. You'll have to pony up, Mr. Frank Goodwin. You're a good fellow, but a gentleman must draw the line at being kicked into the gutter. Blackmail isn't a pretty word, but it's the next station on the road I'm traveling." With purpose in his steps Blythe now moved rapidly through the town by way of its landward environs. He passed through the squalid quarters of the improvident Negroes and on beyond the picturesque shacks of the poorer mestizos. From many points along his course he could see, through the umbrageous glades, the house of Frank Goodwin on its wooded hill. And as he crossed the little bridge over the lagoon he saw the old Indian, Galvez, scrubbing at the wooden slab that bore the name of Miraflores. Beyond the lagoon the lands of Goodwin began to slope gently upward. A grassy road, shaded by a munificent and diverse array of tropical flora, wound from the edge of an outlying banana grove to the dwelling. Blythe took this road with long and purposeful strides. Goodwin was seated on his coolest gallery, dictating letters to his secretary, a sallow and capable native youth. The household adhered to the American plan of breakfast, and that meal had been a thing of the past for the better part of an hour. The castaway walked to the steps and flourished a hand. "Good morning, Blythe," said Goodwin, looking up. "Come in and have a chair. Anything I can do for you?" "I want to speak to you in private." Goodwin nodded at his secretary, who strolled out under a mango tree and lit a cigarette. Blythe took the chair that he had left vacant. "I want some money," he began, doggedly. "I'm sorry," said Goodwin with equal directness, "but you can't have any. You're drinking yourself to death, Blythe. Your friends have done all they could to help you to brace up. You won't help yourself. There's no use furnishing you with money to ruin yourself with any longer." "Dear man," said Blythe, tilting back his chair, "it isn't a question of social economy now. It's past that. I like you, Goodwin, and I've come to stick a knife between your ribs. I was kicked out of Espada's saloon this morning, and society owes me reparation for my wounded feelings." "I didn't kick you out." "No, but in a general way you represent society, and in a particular way you represent my last chance. I've had to come down to it, old man. I tried to do it a month ago when Lasada's man was here turning things over, but I couldn't do it then. Now it's different. I want $1,000, Goodwin, and you'll have to give it to me." "Only last week," said Goodwin with a smile. "A silver dollar was all you were asking for." "An evidence," said Blythe, flippantly, "that I was still virtuous, though under heavy pressure. The wages of sin should be something higher than a peso worth 48 cents. Let's talk business. I am the villain in the third act, and I must have my merited, if only temporary, triumph. I saw you collar the late president's valise full of boodle. Oh, I know it's blackmail, but I'm liberal about the price. I know I'm a cheap villain, one of the regular sawmill drama kind, but you're one of my particular friends, and I don't want to stick you hard." "Suppose you go into the details," suggested Goodwin, calmly arranging his letters on the table. "All right," said Beelzebub. "I like the way you take it. I despise histrionics, so you will please prepare yourself for the facts without any red fire, calcium, or grace notes on the saxophone. On the night that His Fly-by-Night Excellency arrived in town I was very drunk. You will excuse the pride with which I state that fact, but it was quite a feat for me to attain that desirable state. Somebody had left a cot out under the orange trees in the yard of Madama Ortiz's hotel. I stepped over the wall, laid down upon it, and fell asleep. I was awakened by an orange that dropped from the tree upon my nose, and I laid there for a while cursing Sir Isaac Newton, or whoever it was that invented gravitation, for not confining his theory to apples. And then along came Mr. Miraflores and his true love with the treasury in a valise, and went into the hotel. Next you hove in sight, and held a powwow with the tonsorial artist who insisted upon talking shop after hours. I tried to slumber again, but once more my rest was disturbed, this time by the noise of the pop gun that went off upstairs. Then that valise came crashing down into an orange tree just above my head, and I arose from my couch, not knowing when it might begin to rain Saratoga trunks. When the army and the constabulary began to arrive, with their medals and decorations hastily pinned to their pajamas and their snickersnees drawn, I crawled into the welcome shadow of a banana plant. I remained there for an hour, by which time the excitement and the people had cleared away. And then, my dear Goodwin, excuse me, I saw you sneak back and pluck that ripe and juicy valise from the orange tree. I followed you, and saw you take it to your own house. $100,000 crop from one orange tree in a season about breaks the record of the fruit-growing industry. Being a gentleman at that time, Of course, I never mentioned the incident to anyone, but this morning I was kicked out of a saloon. My code of honor is all out at the elbows, and I'd sell my mother's prayer book for 3 fingers of a guardian. I'm not putting on the screws hard. It ought to be worth 1,000 to you for me to have slept on that cot through the whole business without waking up and seeing anything. Goodwin opened 2 more letters and made memoranda in pencil on them. Then he called Manuel to his secretary, who came, spryly. "The Ariel, when does she sail?" asked Goodwin. "Senor," answered the youth, "at 3 this afternoon. She drops down coast to Punta Soledad to complete her cargo of fruit. From there she sails for New Orleans without delay." "Bueno," said Goodwin. "These letters may wait yet a while." The secretary returned to his cigarette under the mango tree. "In round numbers," said Goodwin, facing Blythe squarely, "how much money do you owe in this town, not including the sums you have borrowed from me?" 500 at a rough guess," answered Blythe lightly. "Go somewhere in the town and draw up a schedule of your debts," said Goodwin. "Come back here in 2 hours, and I will send Manuel with the money to pay them. I will also have a decent outfit of clothing ready for you. You will sail on the Ariel at 3. Manuel will accompany you as far as the deck of the steamer. There he will hand you $1,000 in cash. I suppose that we needn't discuss what you will be expected to do in return." "Oh, I understand," piped Blythe, cheerily. "I was asleep all the time on the cot under Madama Ortiz's orange trees, and I shake off the dust of Coralio forever. I'll play fair. No more of the lotus for me. Your proposition is 0. K. You're a good fellow, Goodwin, and I let you off light. I'll agree to everything. But in the meantime, I've a devil of a thirst on, old man." "Not a centavo," said Goodwin firmly, "until you are on board the Ariel. You would be drunk in 30 minutes if you had money now." But he noticed the blood-streaked eyeballs, the relaxed form, and the shaking hands of Beelzebub, and he stepped into the dining room through the low window and brought out a glass and a decanter of brandy. "Take a bracer, anyway, before you go," he proposed, even as a man to the friend whom he entertains. Beelzebub Blythe's eyes glistened at the sight of the solace for which his soul burned. Today, for the first time, his poisoned nerves had been denied their steadying dose, and their retort was a mounting torment. He grasped the decanter and rattled its crystal mouth against the glass in his trembling hand. He flushed the glass and then stood erect, holding it aloft for an instant. For one fleeting moment he held his head above the drowning waves of his abyss. He nodded easily at Goodwin, raised his brimming glass, and murmured a health that men had used in his ancient paradise lost. And then so suddenly that he spilled the brandy over his hand, he set down his glass, untasted. "In 2 hours," his dry lips muttered to Goodwin, as he marched down the steps and turned his face toward the town. In the edge of the cool banana grove, Beelzebub halted and snapped the tongue of his belt buckle into another hole. "I couldn't do it," he explained, feverishly, to the waving banana fronds. "I wanted to, but I couldn't. A gentleman can't drink with the man that he blackmails." The Reformation of Calliope, by O. Henry. Calliope Catesby was in his humors again. Ennui was upon him. This goodly promontory, the earth, particularly that portion of it known as quicksand, was to him no more than a pestilent congregation of vapors. Overtaken by the megrims, the philosopher may seek relief in soliloquy. My lady finds solace in tears. The flaccid Easterner scold at the millinery bills of his women folk. Such recourse was insufficient to the denizens of quicksand. Calliope, especially, was wont to express his ennui according to his lights. Overnight Calliope had hung out signals of approaching low spirits. He had kicked his own dog on the porch of the Occidental Hotel and refused to apologize. He had become capricious and fault-finding in conversation. While strolling about, he reached often for twigs of mesquite and chewed the leaves fiercely. That was always an ominous act. Another symptom alarming to those who were familiar with the different stages of his doldrums was his increasing politeness and a tendency to use formal phrases. A husky softness succeeded the usual penetrating drawl in his tones. A dangerous courtesy marked his manners. Later, his smile became crooked, the left side of his mouth slanting upward, and quicksand got ready to stand from under. At this stage, Calliope generally began to drink. Finally, about midnight, he was seen going homeward, saluting those whom he met with exaggerated but inoffensive courtesy. Not yet was Calliope's melancholy at the danger point. He would seat himself at the window of the room he occupied over Sylvester's tonsorial parlors, and there chant lugubrious and tuneless ballads until morning, accompanying the noises by appropriate maltreatment of a jangling guitar. More magnanimous than Nero, he would thus give musical warning of the forthcoming municipal upheaval that quicksand was scheduled to endure. A quiet, amiable man was Calliope Catesby at other times, quiet to indolence and amiable to worthlessness. At best, he was a loafer and a nuisance. At worst, he was the terror of quicksand. His ostensible occupation was something subordinate in the real estate line. He drove the beguiled Easterner in buckboards out to look over lots and ranch property. Originally, he came from one of the Gulf states, his length 6 feet, slurring rhythm of speech, and sectional idioms giving evidence of his birthplace. And yet, after taking on Western adjustments, this languid pine box whittler, cracker barrel hugger, shady corner lounger of the cotton fields and sumac hills of the South became famed as a bad man among men who had made a lifelong study of the art of truculence. At 9 the next morning, Calliope was fit. Inspired by his own barbarous melodies and the contents of his jug, he was ready primed to gather fresh laurels from the diffident brow of quicksand. Encircled and crisscrossed with cartridge belts, abundantly garnished with revolvers, and copiously drunk, he poured forth into quicksand's main street. Too chivalrous to surprise and capture a town by silent sortie, he paused at the nearest corner and emitted his slogan, that fearful, brassy yell, so reminiscent of the steam piano, that had gained for him the classic appellation that had superseded his own baptismal name. Following close upon his vociferation came 3 shots from his .45 by way of limbering up the guns and testing his aim. A yellow dog, the personal property of Colonel Swazi, the proprietor of the Occidental, fell feet upward in the dust with one farewell yelp. A Mexican who was crossing the street from the Blue Front grocery carrying in his hand a bottle of kerosene was stimulated to a sudden and admirable burst of speed, still grasping the neck of the shattered bottle. The new gilt weathercock on Judge Riley's lemon and ultramarine 2-story residence shivered, flapped, and hung by a splinter, the sport of the wanton breezes. The artillery was in trim. Calliope's hand was steady. The high, calm ecstasy of habitual battle was upon him, though slightly embittered by the sadness of Alexander in that his conquests were limited to the small world of quicksand. Down the street went Calliope, shooting right and left. Glass fell like hail. Dogs vamoosed. Chickens flew, squawking. Feminine voices shrieked concernedly to youngsters at large. The din was perforated at intervals by the staccato of the terror's guns, and was drowned periodically by the brazen screech that quicksand knew so well. The occasions of Calliope's low spirits were legal holidays in quicksand. All along the main street in advance of his coming clerks were putting up shutters and closing doors. Business would languish for a space. The right-of-way was Calliope's, and as he advanced, observing the dearth of opposition and the few opportunities for distraction, his ennui perceptibly increased. But some 4 squares farther down, lively preparations were being made to minister to Mr. Catesby's love for interchange of compliments and repartee. On the previous night, numerous messengers had hastened to advise Buck Patterson, the city marshal, of Calliope's impending eruption. The patience of that official, often strained in extending leniency toward the disturber's misdeeds, had been overtaxed. In quicksand, some indulgence was accorded the natural ebullition of human nature. Providing that the lives of the more useful citizens were not recklessly squandered, or too much property needlessly laid waste, the community sentiment was against a too strict enforcement of the law. But Calliope had raised the limit. His outbursts had been too frequent and too violent to come within the classification of a normal and sanitary relaxation of spirit. Buck Patterson had been expecting and awaiting in his little 10-by-12 frame office that preliminary yell announcing that Calliope was feeling blue. When the signal came, the city marshal rose to his feet and buckled on his guns. 2 deputy sheriffs and 3 citizens who had proven the edible qualities of fire also stood up, ready to bandy with Calliope's leaden jocularities. "Gather that fellow in," said Buck Patterson, setting forth the lines of the campaign. "Don't have no talk, but shoot as soon as you can get a show. Keep behind cover and bring him down. He's a no-good un. It's up to Calliope to turn up his toes this time, I reckon. Go to him all spraddled out, boys. And don't get too reckless, for what Calliope shoots at he hits." Buck Patterson, tall, muscular, and solemn-faced, with his bright city marshal badge shining on the breast of his blue flannel shirt, gave his posse directions for the onslaught upon Calliope. The plan was to accomplish the downfall of the quicksand terror without loss to the attacking party, if possible. The splenetic Calliope, unconscious of retributive plots, was steaming down the channel, cannonading on either side, when he suddenly became aware of breakers ahead. The city marshal and one of the deputies rose up behind some dry goods boxes half a square to the front and opened fire. At the same time, the rest of the posse, divided, shelled him from two side streets up which they were cautiously maneuvering from a well-executed detour. The first volley broke the lock of one of Calliope's guns, cut a neat underbit in his right ear, and exploded a cartridge in his crossbelt, scorching his ribs as it burst. Feeling braced up by this unexpected tonic to his spiritual depression, Calliope executed a fortissimo note from his upper register and returned the fire like an echo. The upholders of the law dodged at his flash, but a trifle too late to save one of the deputies a bullet just above the elbow, and the marshal a bleeding cheek from a splinter that a ball tore from the box he had ducked behind. And now Calliope met the enemy's tactics in kind. Choosing with a rapid eye the street from which the weakest and least accurate fire had come, he invaded it at a double quick, abandoning the unprotected middle of the street. With rare cunning, the opposing force in that direction, one of the deputies and two of the valorous volunteers, waited, concealed by beer barrels, until Calliope had passed their retreat, and then peppered him from the rear. In another moment they were reinforced by the marshal and his other men. And then Calliope felt that in order to successfully prolong the delights of the controversy, he must find some means of reducing the great odds against him. His eye fell upon a structure that seemed to hold out this promise, providing he could reach it. Not far away was the little railroad station, its building a strong box house, 10 by 20 feet, resting upon a platform 4 feet above ground. Windows were in each of its walls. Something like a fort, it might become to a man thus sorely pressed by superior numbers. Calliope made a bold and rapid spurt for it, the marshal's crowd smoking him as he ran. He reached the haven in safety, the station agent leaving the building by a window, like a flying squirrel, as the garrison entered the door. Patterson and his supporters halted under protection of a pile of lumber and held consultations. In the station was an unterrified desperado who was an excellent shot and carried an abundance of ammunition. For 30 yards on either side of the besieged was a stretch of bare, open ground. It was a sure thing that the man who attempted to enter that unprotected area would be stopped by one of Calliope's bullets. The city marshal was resolved. He had decided that Calliope Catesby should no more wake the echoes of quicksand with his strident whoop. He had so announced. Officially and personally, he felt imperatively bound to put the soft pedal on that instrument of discord. It played bad tunes. Standing near was a hand truck used in the manipulation of small freight. It stood by a shed full of sacked wool, a consignment from one of the sheep ranches. On this truck the marshal and his men piled 3 heavy sacks of wool. Stooping low, Buck Patterson started for Calliope's fort, slowly pushing this loaded truck before him for protection. The posse, scattering broadly, stood ready to nip the besieged in case he should show himself in an effort to repel the juggernaut of justice that was creeping upon him. Only once did Calliope make demonstration. He fired from a window, and some tufts of wool spurted from the marshal's trustworthy bulwark. The return shots from the posse pattered against the window frame of the fort. No loss resulted on either side. The marshal was too deeply engrossed in steering his protected battleship to be aware of the approach of the morning train until he was within a few feet of the platform. The train was coming up on the other side of it. It stopped only 1 minute at Quicksand. What an opportunity it would offer to Calliope. He had only to step out the other door, mount the train, and away. Abandoning his breastwork, Buck, with his gun ready, dashed up the steps and into the room, driving upon the closed door with one heave of his weighty shoulder. The members of the posse heard one shot fired inside, and then there was silence. At length the wounded man opened his eyes. After a blank space he again could see and hear and feel and think. Turning his eyes about, he found himself lying on a wooden bench. A tall man with a perplexed countenance, wearing a big badge with City Marshal engraved upon it, stood over him. A little old woman in black, with a wrinkled face and sparkling black eyes, was holding a wet handkerchief against one of his temples. He was trying to get these facts fixed in his mind and connected with past events when the old woman began to talk. "There now, great, big, strong man. That bullet never touched ye. Just skeet along the side of your head and sort of paralyzed ye for a spell. I've heard of sec things afore. Concussion is what they names it. Abel Watkins used to kill squirrels that way barkin' 'em, Abe called it. You just been barked, sir, and you'll be all right in a little bit. Feel lots better already, don't ye? You just lay still a while longer and let me bathe your head. You don't know me, I reckon, and 'tain't surprisin' that you shouldn't. I come in on that train from Alabama to see my son. Big son, ain't he? Lands, you wouldn't hardly think he'd ever been a baby, would ye? This is my son, sir." Half turning, the old woman looked up at the standing man, her worn face lighting with a proud and wonderful smile. She reached out one veined and calloused hand and took one of her sons. Then, smiling cheerily down at the prostrate man, she continued to dip the handkerchief in the waiting room tin wash basin and gently apply it to his temple. She had the benevolent garrulity of old age. "I ain't seen my son before," she continued, "in 8 years. One of my nephews, Elkanah Price, he's a conductor on one of them railroads, and he got me a pass to come out here. I can stay a whole week on it, and then it'll take me back again. Just think, now, that little boy of mine has got to be a officer, a city marshal of a whole town. That's something like a constable, ain't it? I never knowed he was a officer. He didn't say nothin' about it in his letters. I reckon he thought his old mother'd be skeered about the danger he was in. But, laws, I never was much of a hand to get skeered. 'Tain't no use. I heard them guns shootin' while I was gettin' off them cars, and I see smoke a-comin' out of the depot, but I just walked right along. Then I see son's face lookin' out through the window. I knowed him at oncet. He met me at the door, and squeezes me most to death. And there you was, sir, a-lyin' there jest like you was dead, and I 'lowed we'd see what might be done to help sot you up." "I think I'll sit up now," said the concussion patient. "I'm feeling pretty fair by this time." He sat, somewhat weakly yet, leaning against the wall. He was a rugged man, big-boned and straight. His eyes, steady and keen, seemed to linger upon the face of the man standing so still above him. His look wandered often from the face he studied to the marshal's badge upon the other's breast. "Yes, yes, you'll be all right," said the old woman, patting his arm, "if you don't get to cuttin' up eggin' and havin' folks shooting at you. Son told me about you, sir, while you was layin' senseless on the floor. Don't you take it as meddlesome fair an old woman with a son as big as you to talk about it. And you mustn't hold no grudge agin my son for havin' to shoot at ye. A officer has got to take up for the law, it's his duty, and them that acts bad and lives wrong has to suffer. Don't blame my son any, sir, 'tain't his fault. He's always been a good boy good when he was growin' up, and kind and obedient and well-behaved. Won't you let me advise you, sir, not to do so no more? Be a good man, and leave liquor alone, and live peaceably and goodly. Keep away from bad company, and work honest and sleep sweet." The black-mitt hand of the old pleader gently touched the breast of the man she addressed. Very earnest and candid her old, worn face looked. In her rusty black dress and antique bonnet she sat, near the close of a long life, and epitomized the experience of the world. Still the man to whom she spoke gazed above her head, contemplating the silent son of the old mother. "What does the marshal say?" he asked. "Does he believe the advice is good? Suppose the marshal speaks up and says if the talk's all right?" The tall man moved uneasily. He fingered the badge on his breast for a moment, and then he put an arm around the old woman and drew her close to him. She smiled the unchanging mother smile of 80 years and patted his big brown hand with her crooked, mittened fingers while her son spake. I says this, he said, looking squarely into the eyes of the other man, that if I was in your place I'd follow it. If I was a drunken, desperate character, without shame or hope, I'd follow it. If I was in your place and you was in mine I'd say, Marshal, I'm willing to swear if you'll give me the chance I'll quit the racket. I'll drop the tanglefoot and the gunplay, and won't play hoss no more. I'll be a good citizen and go to work and quit my foolishness. So help me God. That's what I'd say to you if you was Marshal and I was in your place. Hear my son talkin', said the old woman softly. Hear him, sir. You promised to be good, and he won't do you no harm. 41 years ago his heart first beat Aegean mine, and it's beat true ever since. The other man rose to his feet, trying his limbs and stretching his muscles. Then, said he, if you was in my place and said that, and I was Marshal, I'd say, go free, and do your best to keep your promise. Lawsy, exclaimed the old woman, in a sudden flutter. Ef I didn't clear forget that trunk of mine. I see a man set in it on the platform just as I seen son's face in the window, and it went plumb out of my head. There's 8 jars of homemade quince jam in that trunk that I made myself. I wouldn't have nothing happen to them jars for a red apple. Away to the door she trotted, spry and anxious, and then Calliope Catesby spoke out to Buck Patterson. I just couldn't help it, Buck. I seen her through the window comin' in. She never had heard a word 'bout my tough ways. I didn't have the nerve to let her know I was a worthless cuss bein' hunted down by the community. There you was lyin' where my shot laid you, like you was dead. The idea struck me sudden, and I just took your badge off and fastened it onto myself, and I fastened my reputation onto you. I told her I was the Marshal, and you was a holy terror. You can take your badge back now, Buck. With shaking fingers, Calliope began to unfasten the disc of metal from his shirt. Easy there, said Buck Patterson. You keep that badge right where it is, Calliope Catesby. Don't you dare to take it off till the day your mother leaves this town. You'll be City Marshal of Quicksand as long as she's here to know it. After I stir around town a bit and put him on, I'll guarantee that nobody won't give the thing away to her. And say, you leather-headed, rip-roarin', low-down son of a locoed cyclone, you follow that advice she give me. I'm going to take some of it myself, too. Buck, said Calliope feelingly, Ef I don't I hope I may. Shut up, said Buck. She's a-comin' back. The Red Roses of Tonia, by O. Henry. A trestle burned down on the International Railroad. The South, bound from San Antonio, was cut off for the next 48 hours. On that train was Tonia Weaver's Easter hat. Esperition, the Mexican, who had been sent 40 miles in a buckboard from the Espinosa Ranch to fetch it, returned with a shrugging shoulder and hands empty except for a cigarette. At the small station, Nopal, he had learned of the delayed train and, having no commands to wait, turned his ponies toward the ranch again. Now, if one supposes that Easter, the goddess of spring, cares any more for the after-church parade on Fifth Avenue than she does for her loyal outfit of subjects that assemble at the meeting house at Cactus, Texas, a mistake has been made. The wives and daughters of the ranchmen of the Frio country put forth Easter blossoms of new hats and gowns as faithfully as is done anywhere, and the Southwest is, for one day, a mingling of prickly pear, Paris, and paradise. And now it was Good Friday, and Tonia Weaver's Easter hat blushed unseen in the desert air of an impotent express car, beyond the burned trestle. On Saturday noon the Rogers girls, from the Shoestring Ranch, and Ella Reeves, from the Ankaro, and Mrs. Bennett and Ida, from Green Valley, would convene at the Espinosa and pick up Tonia. With their Easter hats and frocks carefully wrapped and bundled against the dust, the fair aggregation would then merrily jog the 10 miles to Cactus, where on the morrow they would array themselves, subjugate man, do homage to Easter, and cause jealous agitation among the lilies of the field. Tonia sat on the steps of the Espinosa ranch house, flicking gloomily with a quirt at a tuft of curly mesquite. She displayed a frown and a contumelious lip, and endeavored to radiate an aura of disagreeableness and tragedy. I hate railroads, she announced positively, and men. Men pretend to run them. Can you give any excuse why a trestle should burn? Ida Bennett's hat is to be trimmed with violets. I shall not go one step toward Cactus without a new hat. If I were a man, I would get one. Two men listened uneasily to this disparagement of their kind. One was Wells Pearson, foreman of the Mucho Caller cattle ranch. The other was Thompson Burrows, the prosperous sheepman from the Quintana Valley. Both thought Tonia Weaver adorable, especially when she railed at railroads and menaced men. Either would have given up his epidermis to make for her an Easter hat more cheerfully than the ostrich gives up his tip or the egret lays down its life. Neither possessed the ingenuity to conceive a means of supplying the sad deficiency against the coming Sabbath. Pearson's deep brown face and sunburned light hair gave him the appearance of a schoolboy seized by one of youth's profound and insolvable melancholies. Tonia's plight grieved him through and through. Thompson Burrows was the more skilled and pliable. He hailed from somewhere in the East originally, and he wore neckties and shoes, and was made dumb by woman's presence. "The big waterhole on Sandy Creek," said Pearson, scarcely hoping to make a hit, "was filled up by that last rain." "Oh, was it?" said Tonia sharply. "Thank you for the information. I suppose a new hat is nothing to you, Mr. Pearson. I suppose you think a woman ought to wear an old Stetson 5 years without a change, as you do. If your old waterhole could have put out the fire on that trestle, you might have some reason to talk about it." "I am deeply sorry," said Burrows, warned by Pearson's fate, "that you failed to receive your hat. Miss Weaver deeply sorry, indeed. If there was anything I could do—" "Don't bother," interrupted Tonia, with sweet sarcasm. "If there was anything you could do, you'd be doing it, of course. There isn't." Tonia paused. A sudden sparkle of hope had come into her eye. Her frown smoothed away. She had an inspiration. "There's a store over at Lone Elm crossing on the Nueces," she said, "that keeps hats. Eva Rogers got hers there. She said it was the latest style. It might have some left, but it's 28 miles to Lone Elm." The spurs of two men who hastily arose jingled, and Tonia almost smiled. The knights, then, were not all turned to dust, nor were their rowels rust. "Of course," said Tonia, looking thoughtfully at a white gulf cloud sailing across the cerulean dome. "Nobody could ride to Lone Elm and back by the time the girls call by for me tomorrow. So, I reckon I'll have to stay at home this Easter Sunday." And then she smiled. "Well, Miss Tonia," said Pearson, reaching for his hat, as guileful as a sleeping babe, "I reckon I'll be trotting along back to Mucho Caller. There's some cutting out to be done on Dry Branch first thing in the morning, and me and Roadrunner has got to be on hand. It's too bad your hat got sidetracked. Maybe they'll get that trestle mended yet in time for Easter." "I must be riding too, Miss Tonia," announced Burrows, looking at his watch. "I declare, it's nearly 5 o'clock. I must be out at my lambing camp in time to help pin those crazy ewes." Tonia's suitors seemed to have been smitten with a need for haste. They bade her a ceremonious farewell, and then shook each other's hands with the elaborate and solemn courtesy of the Southwesterner. "Hope I'll see you again soon, Mr. Pearson," said Burrows. "Same here," said the cowman, with the serious face of one whose friend goes upon a whaling voyage. "Be gratified to see you ride over to Mucho Caller any time you strike that section of the range." Pearson mounted Roadrunner, the soundest cowpony on the Frio, and let him pitch for a minute, as he always did on being mounted, even at the end of a day's travel. "What kind of a hat was that, Miss Tonia," he called, "that you ordered from San Antone? I can't help but be sorry about that hat." "A straw," said Tonia. "The latest shape, of course, trimmed with red roses. That's what I like, red roses." "There's no color more becoming to your complexion and hair," said Burrows, admiringly. "It's what I like," said Tonia. "And of all the flowers, give me red roses. Keep all the pinks and blues for yourself. But what's the use, when trestles burn and leave you without anything? It'll be a dry old Easter for me." Pearson took off his hat and drove Roadrunner at a gallop into the chaparral east of the Espinosa Ranch house. As his stirrups rattled against the brush, Burrows's long-legged sorrel struck out down the narrow stretch of open prairie to the southwest. Tonia hung up her quirt and went into the sitting room. "I'm mighty sorry, daughter, that you didn't get your hat," said her mother. "Oh, don't worry, mother," said Tonia, coolly. "I'll have a new hat, all right, in time tomorrow." When Burrows reached the end of the strip of prairie, he pulled his sorrel to the right and let him pick his way daintily across a sequista flat through which ran the ragged, dry bed of an arroyo. Then up a gravelly hill, matted with bush, the horse scrambled, and at length emerged, with a snort of satisfaction, into a stretch of high, level prairie, grassy and dotted with the lighter green of mesquites in their fresh, spring foliage. Always to the right Burrows bore, until in a little while he struck the old Indian trail that followed the Nueces southward, and that passed, 28 miles to the southeast, through Lone Elm. Here Burrows urged the sorrel into a steady lope. As he settled himself in the saddle for a long ride, he heard the drumming of hoofs, the hollow thwack of chaparral against wooden stirrups, the whoop of a Comanche, and Wells Pearson burst out of the brush at the right of the trail like a precocious yellow chick from a dark green Easter egg. Except in the presence of awing femininity, melancholy found no place in Pearson's bosom. In Tonia's presence his voice was as soft as a summer bullfrog's in his reedy nest. Now, at his gleesome yawp, rabbits, a mile away, ducked their ears, and sensitive plants closed their fearful fronds. "Moved your lambing camp pretty far from the ranch, haven't you, neighbor?" asked Pearson, as Roadrunner fell in at the sorrel's side. 28 miles, said Burrows, looking a little grim. Pearson's laugh woke an owl 1 hour too early in his water elm on the river bank, half a mile away. "All right for you, sheepman. I like an open game myself. We're two locoed he-milliners hat-hunting in the wilderness. I notify you, Burr, to mind your corrals. We've got an even start, and the one that gets the headgear will stand some higher at the Espinosa." "You've got a good pony," said Burrows, eyeing Roadrunner's barrel, like body and tapering legs that moved as regularly as the piston rod of an engine. "It's a race, of course, but you're too much of a horseman to whoop it up this soon. Say we travel together till we get to the home stretch." "I'm your company," agreed Pearson, "and I admire your sense. If there's hats at Lone Elm, one of 'em shall set on Miss Tonia's brow tomorrow, and you won't be at the crowning. I ain't bragging, Burr, but that sorrel of yours is weak in the forelegs." "My horse against yours," offered Burrows. "That Miss Tonia wears the hat I take her to Cactus tomorrow." "I'll take you up," shouted Pearson. "But oh, it's just like horse stealing for me. I can use that sorrel for a lady's animal when somebody comes over to Mucho Caller and—" Burrows' dark face glowered so suddenly that the cowman broke off his sentence. But Pearson could never feel any pressure for long. "What's all this Easter business about, Burr?" he asked, cheerfully. "Why do the women folks have to have new hats by the almanac or bust all cinches trying to get 'em?" "It's a seasonable statute out of the Testaments," explained Burrows. "It's ordered by the Pope or somebody, and it has something to do with the zodiac. I don't know exactly, but I think it was invented by the Egyptians." "It's an all-right jubilee if the heathens did put their brand on it," said Pearson, "or else Tonia wouldn't have anything to do with it. And they pull it off at church, too. Suppose there ain't but one hat in the Lone Elm store, Burr." "Then," said Burrows darkly, "the best man of us'll take it back to the Espinosa." "Oh, man," cried Pearson, throwing his hat high and catching it again. "There's nothing like you come off the sheep ranges before. You talk good and collateral to the occasion. And if there's more than one—" "Then," said Burrows, "we'll pick our choice and one of us'll get back first with his and the other won't." "There never was two souls," proclaimed Pearson to the stars, "that beat more like one heart than yourn and mine. Me and you might be riding on a unicorn and thinking out of the same piece of mind." At a little past midnight the riders loped into Lone Elm. The 100 houses of the big village were dark. On its only street the big wooden store stood barred and shuttered. In a few moments the horses were fastened and Pearson was pounding cheerfully on the door of old Sutton, the storekeeper. The barrel of a Winchester came through a cranny of a solid window shutter, followed by a short inquiry. "Wells Pearson, of the Mucho Caller, and Burrows, of Green Valley," was the response. "We want to buy some goods in the store. Sorry to wake you up, but we must have him. Come on out, Vinkle Tommy, and get a move on you." Uncle Tommy was slow, but at length they got him behind his counter with a kerosene lamp lit, and told him of their dire need. "Easter hats?" said Uncle Tommy, sleepily. "Why, yes, I believe I have got just a couple left. I only ordered a dozen this spring. I'll show 'em to you." Now, Uncle Tommy Sutton was a merchant, half asleep or awake. In dusty pasteboard boxes under the counter he had 2 leftover spring hats. But, alas, for his commercial probity on that early Saturday morn, they were hats of 2 springs ago, and a woman's I would have detected the fraud at half a glance. But to the unintelligent gaze of the cowpuncher and the sheepman they seemed fresh from the mint of contemporaneous April. The hats were of a variety once known as cartwheels. They were of stiff straw, colored red, and flat-brimmed. Both were exactly alike, and trimmed lavishly around their crowns with full-blown, immaculate, artificial white roses. "That all you got, Uncle Tommy?" said Pearson. "All right. Not much choice here, Burr. Take your pick." "They're the latest styles," lied Uncle Tommy. "You'd see 'em on Fifth Avenue if you was in New York." Uncle Tommy wrapped and tied each hat in 2 yards of dark calico for a protection. One Pearson tied carefully to his calfskin saddle, thongs, and the other became part of Road Runner's burden. They shouted thanks and farewells to Uncle Tommy and cantered back into the night on the home stretch. The horsemen jockeyed with all their skill. They rode more slowly on their way back. The few words they spoke were not unfriendly. Burrows had a Winchester under his left leg slung over his saddle horn. Pearson had a 6-shooter belted around him. Thus men rode in the Frio country. At 7:30 in the morning they rode to the top of a hill and saw the Espinosa Ranch, a white spot under a dark patch of live oaks, 5 miles away. The sight roused Pearson from his drooping pose in the saddle. He knew what Road Runner could do. The sorrel was lathered and stumbling frequently. Road Runner was pegging away like a donkey engine. Pearson turned toward the sheepman and laughed. "Goodbye, Burr," he cried, with a wave of his hand. "It's a race now. We're on the home stretch." He pressed Road Runner with his knees and leaned toward the Espinosa. Road Runner struck into a gallop, with tossing head and snorting nostrils, as if he were fresh from a month in pasture. Pearson rode 20 yards and heard the unmistakable sound of a Winchester lever throwing a cartridge into the barrel. He dropped flat along his horse's back before the crack of the rifle reached his ears. It is possible that Burrows intended only to disable the horse. He was a good enough shot to do that without endangering his rider. But as Pearson stooped, the ball went through his shoulder and then through Road Runner's neck. The horse fell, and the cowman pitched over his head into the hard road, and neither of them tried to move. Burrows rode on without stopping. In 2 hours Pearson opened his eyes and took inventory. He managed to get to his feet and staggered back to where Road Runner was lying. Road Runner was lying there, but he appeared to be comfortable. Pearson examined him and found that the bullet had creased him. He had been knocked out temporarily, but not seriously hurt. But he was tired, and he lay there on Miss Tonia's hat and ate leaves from a mesquite branch that obligingly hung over the road. Pearson made the horse get up. The Easter hat, loosed from the saddle thongs, lay there in its calico wrappings, a shapeless thing from its sojourn beneath the solid carcass of Road Runner. Then Pearson fainted and fell headlong upon the poor hat again, crumpling it under his wounded shoulders. It is hard to kill a cowpuncher. In half an hour he revived long enough for a woman to have fainted twice and tried ice cream for a restorer. He got up carefully and found Road Runner, who was busy with the nearby grass. He tied the unfortunate hat to the saddle again and managed to get himself there, too, after many failures. At noon a gay and fluttering company waited in front of the Espinosa Ranch. The Rogers girls were there in their new buckboard, and the Ankaro outfit and the Green Valley folks, mostly women, and each and every one wore her new Easter hat, even upon the lonely prairies, for they greatly desired to shine forth and do honor to the coming festival. At the gate stood Tonia, with undisguised tears upon her cheeks. In her hand she held Burrows' lone elm hat, and it was at its white roses, hated by her, that she wept. For her friends were telling her, with the ecstatic joy of true friends, that cartwheels could not be worn, being 3 seasons passed into oblivion. "Put on your old hat and come, Tonia," they urged. "For Easter Sunday," she answered. "I'll die first," and wept again. The hats of the fortunate ones were curved and twisted into the style of spring's latest proclamation. A strange being rode out of the brush among them and there sat his horse languidly. He was stained and disfigured with the green of the grass and the limestone of rocky roads. "Hello, Pearson," said Daddy Weaver. "Look like you've been breaking a Mustang. What's that you've got tied to your saddle pig in a poke?" "Oh, come on, Tonia, if you're going," said Betty Rogers. "We mustn't wait any longer. We've saved a seat in the buckboard for you. Never mind the hat. That lovely muslin you've got on looks sweet enough with any old hat." Pearson was slowly untying the queer thing on his saddle. Tonia looked at him with a sudden hope. Pearson was a man who created hope. He got the thing loose and handed it to her. Her quick fingers tore at the strings. "Best I could do," said Pearson slowly. "What Roadrunner and me done to it will be about all it needs." Oh, it's just the right shape," shrieked Tonia. "And red roses. Wait till I try it on." She flew into the glass and out again, beaming, radiating, blossomed. "Oh, don't red become her?" chanted the girls in recitative. "Hurry up, Tonia." Tonia stopped for a moment by the side of Roadrunner. Thank you, Wells," she said, happily. "It's just what I wanted. Won't you come over to Cactus tomorrow and go to church with me?" "If I can," said Pearson. He was looking curiously at her hat, and then he grinned weakly. Tonia flew into the buckboard like a bird. The vehicle sped away for Cactus. "What have you been doing, Pearson?" asked Daddy Weaver. "You ain't looking so well as common." "Me," said Pearson. "I've been painting flowers. Them roses was white when I left Lone Elm. Help me down, Daddy Weaver, for I haven't got any more paint to spare." The Rotskeller and the Rose, by O. Henry. Miss Posey Carrington had earned her success. She began life handicapped by the family name of Boggs in the small town known as Cranberry Corners. At the age of 18, she had acquired the name of Carrington and a position in the chorus of a metropolitan burlesque company. Thence upward she had ascended by the legitimate and delectable steps of Broiler, member of the famous Dickie Bird Octet, in the successful musical comedy Fudge and Fellows, leader of the Potato Bug Dance in Falderole, and at length to the part of the maid Toinette in The King's Bathrobe, which captured the critics and gave her her chance. And when we come to consider Miss Carrington, she is in the Haiti of flattery, fame, and fizz. And that astute manager, her Timothy Goldstein, has her signature to ironclad papers that she will star the coming season in Dyed Rich's new play, Paresis by Gaslight. Promptly there came to her Timothy a capable 20th century young character actor by the name of Highsmith, who besought engagement as Sol Hadeser, the comic and chief male character part in Paresis by Gaslight. "My boy," said Goldstein, "take the part if you can get it. Miss Carrington won't listen to any of my suggestions. She has turned down half a dozen of the best imitators of the rural dub in the city. She declares she won't set a foot on the stage unless Hadeser is the best that can be raked up. She was raised in a village, you know, and when a Broadway orchid sticks a straw in his hair and tries to call himself a clover blossom, she's on. All right." I asked her, in a sarcastic vein, if she thought Denman Thompson would make any kind of a show in the part. "Oh no," says she. "I don't want him or John Drew or Jim Corbett or any of these swell actors that don't know a turnip from a turnstile. I want the real article. So, my boy, if you want to play Sol Hadeser, you will have to convince Miss Carrington. Luck be with you." Highsmith took the train the next day for Cranberry Corners. He remained in that forsaken and inanimate village 3 days. He found the Boggs family and corkscrewed their history unto the 3rd and 4th generation. He amassed the facts and the local color of Cranberry Corners. The village had not grown as rapidly as had Miss Carrington. The actor estimated that it had suffered as few actual changes since the departure of its solitary follower of Thespis as had a stage upon which 4 years is supposed to have elapsed. He absorbed Cranberry Corners and returned to the city of chameleon changes. It was in the Rotskeller that Highsmith made the hit of his histrionic career. There is no need to name the place. There is but one Rotskeller where you could hope to find Miss Posey Carrington after a performance of The King's Bathrobe. There was a jolly small party at one of the tables that drew many eyes. Miss Carrington, petite, marvelous, bubbling, electric, fame-drunken, shall be named first. Her Goldstein follows, sonorous, curly-haired, heavy, a trifle anxious, as some bear that had caught, somehow, a butterfly in his claws. Next, a man condemned to a newspaper, sad, courted, armed, analyzing for press agents dross every sentence that was poured over him, eating his Alain Newberg in the silence of greatness. To conclude, a youth with parted hair, a name that is ochre to red journals and gold on the back of a supper check. These sat at a table while the musicians played, while waiters moved in the mazy performance of their duties with their backs toward all who desired their service, and all was bizarre and merry because it was 9 feet below the level of the sidewalk. At 11.45 a being entered the Ratskeller. The first violin perceptibly flatted a C that should have been natural. The clarionet blew a bubble instead of a grace note. Miss Carrington giggled and the youth with parted hair swallowed an olive seed. Exquisitely and irreproachably rural was the new entry. A lank, disconcerted, hesitating young man it was, flaxen-haired, gaping of mouth, awkward, stricken to misery by the lights and company. His clothing was butternut, with bright blue tie, showing 4 inches of bony wrist and white-socked ankle. He upset a chair, sat in another one, curled a foot around a table leg and cringed at the approach of a waiter. "You may fetch me a glass of lager beer," he said, in response to the discreet questioning of the servitor. The eyes of the Ratskeller were upon him. He was as fresh as a collard and as ingenuous as a hay rake. He let his eye rove about the place as one who regards, big-eyed, hogs in the potato patch. His gaze rested at length upon Miss Carrington. He rose and went to her table with a lateral, shining smile and a blush of pleased trepidation. "How are ye, Miss Posey?" he said in accents not to be doubted. "Don't ye remember me, Bill Summers, the Summerses that lived back of the blacksmith shop? I reckon I've growed up some since ye left Cranberry Corners. Liza Perry lowed I might see ye in the city while I was here. You know Liza married Benny Stanfield, and she says—" "Ah, say," interrupted Miss Carrington brightly, "Liza Perry is never married. What? Oh, the freckles of her. Married in June," grinned the gossip, "and livin' in the old Tatum place." Ham Riley professed religion. Old Mrs. Blythe sold her place to Captain Spooner. The youngest Waters girl run away with a music teacher. The courthouse burned up last March. Your Uncle Wiley was elected constable. Matilda Hoskins died from runnin' a needle in her hand. And Tom Beadle is courtin' Sally Lathrop. They say he don't miss a night but what he's set in on their porch. "The Wally-eed thing!" exclaimed Miss Carrington, with asperity. "Why, Tom Beadle once, say, you folks excuse me a while. This is an old friend of mine, Mr. What was it? Yes, Mr. Summers, Mr. Goldstein, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Oh, what's yours? Johnny'll do. Come on over here and tell me some more." She swept him to an isolated table in a corner. Her Goldstein shrugged his fat shoulders and beck, one to the waiter. The newspaper man brightened a little and mentioned absinthe. The youth with parted hair was plunged into melancholy. The guests of the Ratskeller laughed, clinked glasses, and enjoyed the comedy that Posey Carrington was treat. Minded them to after her regular performance. A few cynical ones whispered, "Press agent," and smiled wisely. Posey Carrington laid her dimpled and desirable chin upon her hands and forgot her audience, a faculty that had won her laurels for her. "I don't seem to recollect any Bill Summers," she said, thoughtfully gazing straight into the innocent blue eyes of the rustic young man. "But I know the Summerses, all right. I guess there ain't many changes in the old town. You see any of my folks lately?" And then Highsmith played his trump. The part of Sol Hadeser called for pathos as well as comedy. Miss Carrington should see that he could do that as well. "Miss Posey," said Bill Summers, "I was up to your folks' house just 2 or 3 days ago. No, there ain't many changes to speak of. The lilac bush by the kitchen window is over a foot higher, and the elm in the front yard died and had to be cut down. And yet it don't seem the same place that it used to be." "How's Ma?" asked Miss Carrington. "She was set in by the front door, crocheting a lamp mat when I saw her last," said Bill. "She's older'n she was, Miss Posey, but everything in the house looked just the same. Your ma asked me to set down. 'Don't touch that willow rocker, William,' says she. It ain't been moved since Posey left, and that's the apron she was hemmin', layin' over the arm of it, just as she flung it. I'm in hopes, she goes on, that Posey'll finish runnin' out that hymn some day. Miss Carrington beckoned peremptorily to a waiter. A pint of extra dry, she ordered briefly, and give the check to Goldstein. The sun was shireen in the door, went on the chronicler from Cranberry, and your ma was set in right in it. I asked her if she hadn't better move back a little. William, says she, when I get sot down and lookin' down the road, I can't bear to move. Never a day, says she, but what I set here every minute that I can spare and watch over them palins for Posey. She went away down that road in the night, for we seen her little shoe tracks in the dust, and something tells me she'll come back that way again when she's weary of the world and begins to think about her old mother. When I was comin' away, concluded Beale, I pulled this off in the bush by the front steps. I thought maybe I might see you in the city, and I knowed you'd like something from the old home. He took from his coat pocket a rose, a drooping, yellow, velvet, odorous rose that hung its bead in the foul atmosphere of that tainted Rotskeller like a virgin bowing before the hot breath of the lions in a Roman arena. Miss Carrington's penetrating but musical laugh rose above the orchestra's rendering of Bluebells. Oh, say, she cried, with glee, ain't those poky places the limit? I just know that 2 hours at Cranberry Corners would give me the horrors now. Well, I'm awful glad to have seen you, Mr. Summers. Guess I'll bustle around to the hotel now and get my beauty sleep. She thrust the yellow rose into the bosom of her wonderful, dainty, silken garments, stood up and nodded imperiously at her Goldstein. Her 3 companions and Bill Summers attended her to her cab. When her flounces and streamers were all safely tucked inside, she dazzled them with au revoirs from her shining eyes and teeth. Come around to the hotel and see me, Bill, before you leave the city, she called as the glittering cab rolled away. Highsmith, still in his makeup, went with her Goldstein to a cafe booth. Bright idea, eh? Asked the smiling actor. Ought to land Sol Hadeser for me, don't you think? The little lady never once tumbled. I didn't bear your conversation, said Goldstein, but your makeup and acting was 0. K. Here's to your success. You'd better call on Miss Carrington early tomorrow and strike her for the part. I don't see how she can keep from being satisfied with your exhibition of ability. At 11:45 a.m. on the next day, Highsmith, handsome, dressed in the latest mode, confident, with a fuchsia in his buttonhole, sent up his card to Miss Carrington in her select apartment hotel. He was shown up and received by the actress's French maid. I am sorry, said Lily Hortense, but I am to say this to all. It is with great regret. Mies car. Rington have cancelled all engagements on the stage and have returned to live in that how you call that town? Cranberry Corner.